Welcome back to Amplified. The census showed shifts in our population that impacted the balance of power in our legislative branch. Some states gained seats in Congress, while others are losing representation. But there's a problem. Certain communities may have been vastly undercounted, which means that they're also going to be underrepresented in Washington. It also means that they could see a disproportionate amount of federal funding. Cities, states, and tribal nations across the United States are now challenging the count. For example, Detroit's mayor believes tens of thousands of people were missed in the majority black city. Leaders in Somerton, Arizona say it's impossible that they've lost residents when the Hispanic majority community grew so much that they needed to build a new high school. And lots of college towns say they were undercounted because students left campuses due to COVID. So how do these challenges work? And what's at stake? And will we see a real resolution to all of this? Joining me now to answer all these questions is Cara Brumfield, a senior policy analyst with the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality. Cara, welcome to Amplified. First, I want to ask, how is it possible that the census count is so off in some cities?
Yeah, well, there were a lot of challenges with the census this time around. The census is never perfect. It's always challenging to conduct a census, but this time around, the pandemic hit right when critical operations were underway. And even putting the pandemic aside, there were other problems as well. There is a ton of distrust of the federal government that causes people to be hesitant to participate in the census, for example. There were also challenges around funding and political interference. All of these things combine to make this a particularly challenging census for the Census Bureau to conduct.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't want us to forget that right now, the Trump administration is actually it's been determined that they did interfere with the execution of the census. They were attempting to mess up the count, if you will, to undercount people of color, to undercount urban areas in a way that they could move around and proportionally manipulate representation, but certainly the way that funding flows. And so for folks who forget, why we talk about the census in the first place, every 10 years, the population of the United States is counted because the federal government needs to understand how to fairly, in theory, and justly distribute resources around the country. And that's based on population. And then, of course, representation in Congress is also supposed to be based on population and how those lines are drawn. We know that the last administration tried to do everything within its power to make sure that it was all mucked up. But at the end of the day, as you started to allude to, talk to us a little bit more about why it is so hard to count the census. And sometimes it is a little bit botched and a deep undercount, especially in urban areas like New York City, of black and brown communities. Why is it so tricky?
Yeah, well, the Census Bureau does find it harder to count people of color. Black people, for example, have seen undercounts in the decennial census for many decades. And with 2010, it seemed like things were beginning to improve. But it's looking like, based on some preliminary analyses that we're seeing, that the undercount of the Black population may have actually gone a bit backwards, and we may see a worse undercount of Black people this time around in 2020 than in 2010. And there are a lot of complicated reasons for that, to be sure. One of those reasons is that Black people are overrepresented in a lot of groups that the Bureau considers hard to count. For example, renters. The census is conducted largely based on reaching out to people at their address, and renters are more likely to move around more frequently. And it makes it a little bit harder for the Census Bureau to find them and make sure that they're counted accurately. People of color and Black people are also more likely to be part of other groups the Bureau considers hard to count, such as people experiencing poverty, people experiencing homelessness, and are also disproportionately affected by things like climate-related disasters. People who are displaced by some of the climate-related disasters that we saw during this census cycle were also hard to count because, again, they just weren't in the places that they normally would have been.
Right. Cities in 14 states are now asking the Census Bureau to allow them to challenge the tally. That includes the four biggest cities in the United States: New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Houston. How can these cities go about proving that their populations are higher than the census actually revealed?
That's right. A lot of localities, cities, these big cities, they're looking to work with the census through the programs that the census makes available to provide their own data to the Census Bureau that the Census Bureau can then use to fix some of the official census numbers. Now, those programs that do exist for local areas to submit their own data to the Census Bureau to try to fix some of these problems, the programs are they're narrow in scope. There are very specific types of data that are allowed to be considered in the programs, and there are very specific types of errors that these programs correct for. But there is some positive news. There's reason to be hopeful. For example, a lot of places, college towns, as you mentioned, are worried about the count because students weren't on campus. They went home. So the Census Bureau has really been listening to what census advocates are saying, and they are working on a new program right now that is going to be designed specifically to address challenges such as undercounts resulting from, say, students not being on campus, and other problems that are related
Mm-hmm.
to what the census refers to as group quarters, so prisons and hospitals and places like that.
That's right. The Census Bureau said that they're actually going to review those counts, which is a big deal. And the cities want that review expanded to include apartment buildings as well. I think you brought up renters as being part of the hard to reach population. I'm curious, is it common for these tallies to be updated? How often do we have recounts?
Well, there aren't frequently recounts, but after every census, there is an opportunity to uh, submit information to fix problems with the base, and then every year there is the population estimates challenge program. So every year between the censuses, there is another shot, so to speak, at working with the bureau to get the numbers updated. And the changes that are made through the population estimates challenge program, those make a difference for federal funding. Those influence the direction of the $1.5 trillion in federal funding that is directed into communities across the country every year.
Say more about that, because I'm really interested. If we are in a process of updating the tally, we're challenging the original count. Lawmakers are going about the business of appropriations and allocating resources right now. So talk to us about how this process at the Census Bureau, the challenge that these cities are making, is going to either interject in or, move the outcomes in some kind of way of those funding streams.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, the census is important to redistricting and apportionment, but these challenge programs are not going to affect those uses of census data, but they can affect these funding streams. And some of the really important programs uh, that are funded, that money is distributed out to states and communities for based on census data or census related data, include programs that support things like healthcare. So Medicaid is one of the biggest programs that is allocated based on census related data, but also programs that support education and supports for access to healthy and affordable food. So things that are really important for families. And so communities who are undercounted in the census are disadvantaged and disenfranchised, not only politically, but also economically.
Real quick, while I have you, I'm curious if you think that, or could you share with us anything the census is doing to overcorrect for or just acknowledge that the last process may have been botched because of political motivations? And is there something that they're doing to try to make this process, run more smoothly so it can't be interfered with again?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's hard for me to say right now what the census is working on, but I know that census advocates have been in close conversation with the Bureau and are working with the Bureau and looking ahead to 2030 to make sure that plans are in place to not only make sure that the count is fair and accurate, but to try to prevent exactly that. Another situation where there's undue political influence on the census. The census is so incredibly foundational to our democracy. It just isn't right that there should be any political interference. It really undermines and disenfranchises communities when we have that political interference. And the census, it should be apolitical. It's about the fairness and the equity of our democracy. So it's really important, and we'll see what changes happen between now and then to make sure that that fairness is protected for 2030.
Cara Brumfield, Senior Policy Analyst at the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality. Thank you so much for joining me tonight on Amplified.